All right. Welcome everyone to a special edition of today's University of Texas Energy Symposium as part of UT Hydrogen. So I'm Gary Bean, Research Scientist and Assistant Director at the Energy Institute. It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's Energy Symposium. And that was Frank Bowen. So a little background on Frank is the president and CEO of the Washington DC-based Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association. It's the Energy Association for Hydrogen Energy and Fuel Cell Technologies for the United States. For 30 years, FCHEA has advocated for funding and policies to support and encourage fuel cell and hydrogen development and deployment at all levels of government and private sector. Prior to his role at FCHEA, Willett served as Senior Vice President at Fuel Cell Energies, has a background in industry outside of hydrogen as well, in international energy services company, power development, investment company, public energy resources corporation, and is a management consultant, providing insights, clients, emerging technologies, and utility. Mr. Willett serves as the chair now of the Global Hydrogen Industry Association Alliance, and he serves at the appointment of Secretary of Commerce to the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Advisory Committee. His talk today will give us a little background on the history of hydrogen, which has in a few years emerged from its historical uses as an industrial gas and feedstock for chemicals into a role as a key resource for decarbonization. So his presentation today will describe the evolution of hydrogen from an industrial gas produced and used for nearly 100 years to a far-reaching decarbonization tool with the potential to provide 15% U.S. total energy demand by 2050. So we'll discuss the types of production and hydrogen technologies and we'll outline the rationale and the goals for the United States efforts and other efforts around the globe to advance hydrogen, hard-to-abate sectors of the economy. So with that said, let's welcome our speaker, Frank Bowen.
Thank you. One of my staff. Right after that, did a great job. When I was asked to, I want to thank you with the Texas for inviting me to attend here and present this symposium. When this theme of hydrogen and the energy transition, emerging from research topics to national priority was kind of put together, I kind of talked about this like that, and about 4 months went by, and I said, well, how much time do I have? And so you've got about 35 minutes. There's no way I could possibly cover all that in 35 minutes. But I'm going to give it my best attempt. What I hope to do is to cover, in a sense, well, why is hydrogen important? And the other thing I want to cover is why is it different now than it might have been 10 years ago? And to leave you with a sort of a perspective on hydrogen similar to the perspective that you might have when the term electricity or natural gas is used. There's a lot of data about hydrogen, a lot of reports, a lot of studies, a lot of great detailed work going on by yourselves and by members of the labs here and at the University of Texas. And sometimes it's good to just take a step back and think, well, what got us here in the first place? So what I'm going to do is consolidate this. As I was putting this together, I began to use adverbs of why are we here? How did we get here? Who's involved? And so that became really the topic of this particular effort. And you'll see me kind of using these 5 terms throughout the half-an-hour presentation. There's also a 6th term, which is wow. And if I get to the end of this and you really think it was a good job, hopefully you'll leave here saying, wow, I learned something. So let's start with just simply the who. I already had a brief introduction. I will say that I'm not a UT graduate, but I have had the privilege of studying for one of my engineering exams for professional licensing here at the University of Texas. So in a full circle, all roads lead back to UT at some point in your career. As far as the association, who we are the National Industry Association for Hydrogen. We have been advocating for hydrogen for nearly 35 years. I rounded it up to 35. It was over 30, but we're getting so close to 35 that it's really 35 years. We had our roots as the National Hydrogen Association. That was merged with an entity called the U.S. Fuel Cell Council in 2010 to form FCHEA. We have over 100 leading companies who are all looking to find their place in uplifting hydrogen. And from our origins, we were part of a lot of the origin and the evolution of a lot of the laws and policies that are now being brought to fruition. You've heard about some of the things with the IRA this morning. Our organization and staff were heavily involved in that when they were just concepts. The concepts of the storage tax credit, the concepts of the production tax credit were very fundamental. And that goes back to 2018, 2019, 2020, before they became part of law. And we find ourselves also at the vanguard of defining what new policies and new activities are going to be necessary to continue the progress of this industry. The membership, I'm going to dwell on this for like a second so you can look at that. There's a lot of logos and entities that you'll find familiar. Some of you are in the room, but we represent the full spectrum of production, distribution, and use. The goal of these members is to uplift all hydrogen. We have members that are purely green, members that are blue, and everybody in between. And it makes for a very robust kitchen table discussion when we get a lot of our members together trying to figure out how do we advance hydrogen in a way that is meaningful for everybody involved. Now, I'll sort of get to why are we here? Why am I here? Well, I'm here fundamentally because today is National Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day. You already heard this, but I'm going to tell you a couple other things. In my world, this is a very important day. It is probably the most important day short of February 27th, which happens to be my wife's birthday. So if any of you have spouses or plan to get married, find somebody whose birthday is October 8th, and you're going to have a beautiful life. So you can put everything together into one day. There's also another little story about Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day. 10 years ago, it was formed by our association when this industry was a lot smaller, and we were sitting around. I was not involved at the time, but we were, members were sitting around a conference room talking about the need for visibility, and someone came up with the idea that we should have our own day. Well, that sounded like a really good idea, and why not? So a few calls were made to Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Senator Richard Blumenthal in Connecticut, and said, would you be willing to sponsor a bipartisan resolution in the Senate that would announce Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day? And they said, great idea. So 10 years ago, this annual event is a bipartisan effort, probably one of the few 10-year-long bipartisan efforts that go on in Congress. Every year it comes out and they form a proclamation. It is officially in the U.S. because of the resolution identified as Hydrogen Fuel Cell Day, but around the world it is really known as Hydrogen Day. And we take a lot of pride in being part of the origin. I'm happy to give you a tour of the office and get a cup of coffee from the coffee machine where it was all formed if you really get to Washington at some point in time. But that's the background of why we're here. The importance of why we're here is in this chart. This chart represents the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, roughly 6.3 million metric tons of CO2 by sector. And this chart, in order to reduce carbon, this chart has to shrink and the pieces of the pie have to be adjusted somewhat. And without hydrogen, it is impossible to shrink this chart or to achieve the adjustments needed to transition some of the higher hydrocarbon activities and carbon intensive activities to lower ones. We can reduce consumption, probably impractical. We can improve efficiencies. There will be meaningful improvements in process, but you're not going to be able to transition this amount of carbon intensity and carbon emissions to something smaller unless you transfer activity from higher carbon activity to lower carbon activity. That will occur from electrification, but it will also occur from introducing different fuel pathways for transportation and replacing heavy hydrocarbon fuels with lower hydrocarbon fuels and feedstocks that are hydrocarbon intensive to less hydrocarbon. Hydrogen is effectively an essential element, literally, in that effort. There's another piece to this. There's an economic proposition here. The size of the effort is not just about the impact it does in potentially shrinking that pie, but it also has some economic benefits. There's a number of projections and studies about the size of the hydrogen activities in the U.S., over $750 billion of potential new investment, 3.4 million jobs, the ability to create a fuel that is domestic, contributing and complementing the other domestic fuels we have with the production of oil, the production of natural gas. The production of U.S. hydrogen has other value outside of the U.S. itself. In numbers, by 2050, it's expected that the hydrogen contribution in the United States could reduce carbon emissions, that 6 million metric tons, downwards by about 16%, with a parallel contribution of reducing nitrous oxide by about 36%. You heard a number this morning, about 12% total energy worldwide might be converted to hydrogen. Those figures in the US are roughly about the same, 14 to 15% total energy. And considering the United States consumes 95 quadrillion BTUs of energy, or about 16% of the world's energy, 15% of that is a very large number to transfer to low carbon intensity or zero carbon intensity hydrogen. So now we're going to get into the what. The next few slides are going to kind of walk through some of what you've already heard, but in sort of a condensed version of why is this meaningful? Why, what's going on with all this hydrogen? Why does it have merit? The first chart that's up here is one that's going to describe where we are today. Hydrogen exists. It has been existing in our lives in the background, transported by companies like Air Liquide, Linde, Air Products from place to place for industrial purposes. It's found in refineries. It's found in ammonia production. But we really don't notice it much unless you're in the petrochemical industry or in the bulk world. But it is safely moving around to the tune of about $17.5 billion worth of commerce in the United States and 11 million metric tons. About 77% of that comes from direct steam methane reforming, which I'll talk about a little bit later. About 25% of that is byproduct. There really is a lot more, probably about 90 to 95% of it is steam methane reforming, because some of that byproduct and refining originates with the reforming process. So most of the hydrogen in the United States is formed by the reformation of methane into hydrogen. And that's kind of a starting point for where we're going to be talking about where we go from next. I'm going to skip this and I'm going to come back to that. This picture here in front of you really dimensionalizes very simply the two pathways of hydrogen. On the left, you've got the refinery type picture here with a steam methane reformer. And on the right, you have an early example of electrolyzer built by Norsk Hydro in Rjukan, Norway, back in the 1940s. I like this, the Norway picture, because it kind of gives a sense of bulk that even back in the 30s, there were large electrolyzers. But all of the activity in hydrogen really migrates from these 2 points. Either you're SMR based, taking hydrocarbons and breaking out the hydrogen from that, or you are starting with electricity and creating hydrogen electrochemically. And just about all of the activity that we see in hydrogen falls in these two gaps, or these two areas. There are middle points. There's methane pyrolysis in the middle. There's geological hydrogen. But fundamentally, you're either talking about gray hydrogen as you move from that upper right corner, upper left corner with the steam methane reformer. You have, without a carbon capture, you've got the grayer part of that band below you, which is pure steam methane reforming, 8 to 10 kilograms of CO2 for each kilogram of hydrogen produced. On the other extreme, you have purely electrolytic hydrogen, and if it's tied to a zero carbon resource with its nuclear, geothermal, nuclear, hydroelectric, solar, or wind, you have a zero hydrogen kilogram per CO2 per hydrogen produced. So what you have is really this, you've heard about this sort of color spectrum. It really is two sides. And I think Chevron talked about this morning. You really have gray hydrogen moving to blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. Everything else is sort of an adaptation of the color. The goal that we have in the United States is really to, and across the world, is to migrate this gray area to bluer where natural gas is available, or even all the way over to green. But these two pictures really frame, you're either starting from an electrolytic world or you're starting from an SMR world with carbon capture, and all the types of hydrogen production will be formed around that particular basis. I want to go up now. And also in that band, in the middle of that band is the number 4. It's not shown on the screen, but that will become important later when I talk about some policy. This particular chart you saw earlier is something that came out of the U.S. Department of Energy. It's actually really functional because what it describes is hydrogen exists in a mix between the electrical world and the molecule world. Our fossil resources are molecule-based. The electric world that we live in with renewables and solar and wind and the grid, provides electrons for electrolysis to make hydrogen. There's also natural gas that can be made into hydrogen from SMR. On the right-hand side, you've got those kind of different uses of hydrogen around the hydrogen, blue hydrogen molecule. But when I talked about that pie chart earlier and those segments of the U.S. economy, there's a term that's often used. It's called the hard-to-abate sectors. And those are areas where it's really hard to introduce other means to decarbonize. In hydrogen, they kind of fall into some categories of power generation, the ability to put long-term, long-duration storage together, transportation, light and heavy-duty vehicles, freight fleets, ports, aircraft. Then you've got other areas of feedstock and derivatives. We use hydrogen today to make ammonia. We use hydrogen today to make SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. Hydrogen is an input to those. And green hydrogen being used to replace gray hydrogen and ammonia is a decarbonization activity. And then you've got other uses in just chemical steel, cement, where a need for heat is important, and there aren't very clean ways to derive heat. So you see hydrogen kind of finding its way in this world between electricity, production, making hydrogen, natural gas, decarbonizing, making production, and then a variety of uses. And the world of all of our policies, the world that is based on research, really kind of evolves around this chart. It's pretty powerful when you really kind of look at what it tells you in a very tight image. I have to find the person at the Department of Energy who created it. Let me skip. Oh, did I get the name? Did I get the presentation? I think I hit the wrong. Go up. Hit the top button. It got me out of queue. There you go. I'll go back to the end. Ah, there you go. Perfect. Okay, there you go. Move on that chart. This particular chart talks about the production pathways. It's very similar to the other chart, but it really sees from the standpoint of green hydrogen. If you start with those electrons and you move into directly making hydrogen or making derivatives, you then have to move into a transportation mode, which involves storage, pipelines, carriers, and then you get into ultimately the uses. This sort of flow chart kind of describes the way the electron might flow to potentially be combined with CO2 to make sustainable aviation fuels, e-fuels, and then obviously find its way into different ways of being transported, finally to end use. This activity in hydrogen is not limited to the United States. Globally, around the world, we have countries pursuing hydrogen activities. They are roughly cataloged by the Hydrogen Council in a recent report, about 1,500 projects going on in the world, many of them concentrated in Europe, some in North America, some in Latin America, and kind of tailing off. That amount of investment is roughly $680 billion of investment needed to carry those projects forward. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. So what it says is, in addition to producing the hydrogen, to look at the various uses, that the magnitude of projects that have yet to evolve is enormous. The amount of investment is enormous, and the policy pathways and policy activities going on around the world are going to have to keep evolving in order to match up the amount of money needed with the correct incentives and with the correct targets for opportunity to manufacture hydrogen and utilize it. A lot of work to be done. This chart is somewhat interesting because it describes the tip of this in the upper right-hand corner in the later years begins to show the incremental amount of hydrogen. This chart really shows $10 to $15 billion a year annually being deployed for clean energy in the United States. You look at the bar chart, it's solar, it's wind. And only in the last few years have we begun to see anything that begins to look like it introduces both sustainable aviation fuels and hydrogen. So the trend is clearly upward. Remember also that if this is a 15% of total energy, it is not going to be uncommon to see hydrogen being a smaller piece of the total amount of this bar chart as more and more investments gets made in renewable resources. But the fact that it's existing and was barely noticeable even 3 or 4 years ago is monumental in the world of hydrogen. That these investments have to keep growing and they have to be complemented with policies that I'll talk about and incentivized by policies I'll talk about later. Now I want to kind of pivot a little bit here and get into somewhat of a when. We've talked about, what, how is hydrogen used? How is it operating in the world? What kind of production methods? Where are the utilization cases? But it's important to consider that hydrogen it has been around for a considerable amount of time, but the utilization as an energy form is a rather new phenomenon. And what I'm going to do is sort of compartmentalize this into 3 areas. I'm going to characterize this in hydrogen in the form of the industrial era, hydrogen in a period of time that I'm going to call convergence, and then hydrogen looking forward in what I'm going to call an energy era. Convergence was something I had to come up with because it was almost like a renaissance. The period of time I'll show you on the next chart is really a time where so many things happened. It was almost like a renaissance of activity, but because 2 or 3 major factors came together, the term convergence seemed to fit that better. You look at this particular chart here, in the yellow, you've got the industrial era, and I boxed this into the period from about 1900 to 1950, 1950 to 2000, and then the period of 2000 to 2020, which is really important in the timeline. It's kind of a pivotal time. And then as you look at the blue area, it really is all the future activities. Prior to about 2000, almost all of the activity, and now hydrogen goes back even earlier than 1900, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, lab related work was undertaken to define electrolysis, to define chemical reactions, to identify hydrogen. But fundamentally around the 1918, 1919, and a little bit later, you began to see the industrialization of actual applications of hydrogen being formed. And you had early uses, you had practical electrolysis. The electrolysis facility that I showed you in Norway was started as a result of Norsk Hydro wanting to make fertilizers without the carbon intensity of feed a hungry world, and the idea of creating electrolysis to make lots of hydrogen to create fertilizers was part of their business model. And then you also had, leading up into World War II, that same facility was used to make heavy water for reasons that probably aren't all too popular. And then you also had the emergence of the industrial gas industry. All the major industrial gas companies were sort of formed in that period. The Lindy's, Air Products, Air Liquides, all came together. And you also had the creation through in the United States with Standard Oil creating the SMR technology for further refinement. So there's a lot of very industrial-like activity going on. As you look later on, post-World War II, you just saw the growth in hydrogen as an industrial feedstock. Processes got improved, but it was also very much still an industrial fuel era. We began to see the emergence of fuel cells with NASA using hydrogen for space travel. There were certainly improvements in all of these processes going on up until about 2000, but other than the bulk industrial hydrogen, most of the hydrogen use or hydrogen activity was still at the laboratory scale. Very, very small pilots. There was some fuel cell technology starting to emerge at the end of the 1990s, but really this period of yellow was really characterized as an industrial gas era. The pivotal piece of convergence has occurred because of a couple of phenomena. All of the early stage development activities that emerged, the refinements in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the refinements in electrolysis, improvements in reliability, improvements in refueling station, all happened at low volume, but they happened with a very steady drumbeat of activity. And a lot of it is in that period from 2000 to 2020. Not much volume of hydrogen, but a great deal of advancement in electrochemistry, in robustness of technologies, coupled with 2 other growth areas. The emergence of renewable energy. That period from 2000 to 2020 is the same period of time where we started to see wind resources and solar resources. And we saw the necessity of societal necessity of recognizing that we have to remove carbon. So you had this built up activity of all this hydrogen technology starting to come to a point where it was proven, it was available, it hadn't been scaled, there's still cost effectiveness that has to be wrung out. But that crossed over at the same point that we recognized that if we had sufficient renewable resources, we could utilize hydrogen to drive out the amount of carbon in our industries. It also really became the point where we started to look at the possibility of commercial carbon capture. That period of 2020 to 2020 didn't see a lot of volume of hydrogen, of new hydrogen, but what it saw was this convergence of technology readiness along with societal readiness that really leads hydrogen to where it is today, which really starts this period of what I'm calling the energy era, where hydrogen, in addition to being an industrial gas, really has the ability to be an energy tool contributing to some of that 15% of total energy and being actually used as a fuel, being used in new resources. So we find ourselves, and a lot of students in this room are really at a point where you're at the beginning of the hydrogen energy era. We've been using hydrogen for a long time, but the policies, we get into the next piece of how, are really driven around and look to promote how do we take this hydrogen and make it part of our energy landscape. No. How? Okay. The how really it relates to policy. We've looked at the what, when, but how do you do this? Hydrogen is relatively expensive. How do you get these nascent technologies moving forward? What's it take to get this apparatus of hydrogen moving is sort of the how that I deal with as someone who interfaces with policy, and a lot of other governments deal with it. But the how is really the means by which a lot of the implementation of all the great research and all the activity that we've talked about the past couple of days gets to fruition. There's really two ways in which that kind of starts. One is strategies, governmental strategies, and the other is what I'll describe generally as interventions. It's economic stimulus, interventions, laws. And in the United States, we have a national clean hydrogen strategy. The bar chart shows that, from the roughly 10 million metric tons of hydrogen that are consumed today in industrial form, the goal is to start introducing 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen, growing to ultimately 50 million metric tons as part of that goal set toward 15% of our total energy use. The bar chart cumulatively looks at the various areas in which hydrogen has inroads. All these charts are available. This is a DOE chart. You can find it on one of the DOE's websites. So what's important about this is that it's a starting point for discussing the fact that all countries and governments are taking these kind of strategic studies and looking at them, and they all seem to find the same. They also seem to be based on the same 3 points. One is, what resources do we have available in the boundaries of the country? What infrastructure is available? And then what are the goals, both environmental as well as economic? And every country that develops a strategy tends to operate around those same 3 factors. Some are rich in resources to produce hydrogen, very low in infrastructure or utilization. Others are a mix. The United States is sort of blessed with both the ability to consume and produce. And so all the roadmaps and strategic documents that you see being built around the world all have sort of those same 3 dimensions. This policy momentum is growing. And if you think of that timeline, this chart here is really from about 2018 through till today. So it really is in that same time frame of the end of the 2020 period, where there's an acceleration in this particular case in the form of a lot of strategic studies being put together by countries to determine what is their pathway, how do they use hydrogen, and how do we take advantage of this wonderful resource. This chart is also very interesting from the standpoint that if you overlay the evolution of renewable portfolio standards in the United States from the period of about 2020 until 2000 until about 2020, you see a very similar pattern. Other than California back in the 1980s creating a renewable portfolio standard, I think Hawaii was back there as well. Most of the states followed a kind of a build-up pattern from about 2001 to about 2018, where they began to realize we have to start implementing renewable policy standards in order for us to decide what policies do we need. So these roadmaps for hydrogen follow the same kind of a factoring that I think happened with renewable energy, where there was planning, there was discussion about how renewables get built. long pathways. And these studies really yielded what's even more important, which are the policies. In the United States, we have two fundamental policies, major policies that have driven hydrogen to where it is. One was the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, and then the other one is the 2022 IRA. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law created two basic, a number of things, but the two big things are, one, it funded the hydrogen hubs. High velocity hub, you can hear about it later. The Arches hub, the Arch 2, the MEC 2, all the hubs that were chosen on this particular map were created out of the idea that the government should make a direct investment in the starting point of hydrogen in the form of these hubs to be complemented by private industry. So the BIL was in a lot of ways a payment, down payment investment in industrial and energy policy. A lot of other countries use direct payment, other market forces or mandates. The US does things generally in the form of tax credits. This was a case where the government was making direct investments in sort of a public-private partnership. Beyond the hubs, the BIL also created several other things. It was created about $1.5 billion for clean hydrogen production, about $750 million that has already gone into various projects to stimulate electrolysis manufacturing. And then it created the funding for the US to go out and define and create the National Clean Hydrogen Strategy. But the hydrogen hubs were the primary inputs for the BIL. Then you got the IRA, which in some ways is a complement, but it actually is an accelerator. Most of the investment in renewable energy and energy in the United States comes in the form of tax credits, investment tax credits, production tax credits. Hydrogen followed that same suit. The IRA created a model of various tax credits and improved certain tax credits. Some credits, like the 49Q carbon capture credit, was in place. It got modified and adjusted. Some of the investment tax credits for energy technologies were in place. They got modified. There was an interesting addition of a storage credit, which I'm proud to say that FCHA was heavily involved in the origin of that. It's amazing what you can do with a conversation with congressional staffers in a room where you bring up an idea like, isn't a storage credit a good idea? And then there's a conversation that ensues where it really is a good idea to have a storage tax credit, because storage in and of itself is expensive. It takes certain investments, and it's worthy of a complementary investment along with a production tax credit. Now, I won't get into much discussion about this, but the storage tax credit is somewhat confounded by our Treasury's inability to see the bigger picture, and is defined it narrowly as a requirement of energy in and energy out, which means that storage in a pure sense of putting hydrogen in the ground for use in multiple markets and multiple end uses is kind of defined to be limited. We're trying to change that, but it really puts a block on the real value of having storage as part of an infrastructure component, as we see with natural gas and even with batteries. But that's a separate subject. But the IRA created predominantly one item, and that was the production tax credit. And remember that number 4 I mentioned on that scale from 10 to 0. 4 happens to be the starting point for the 4 tiers of the investment tax credit. It was talked about earlier this morning. There were sort of 3 steps going from 60 cents to $3, depending on the level of carbon intensity, all designed to drive the opportunity for carbon reductions through hydrogen. There are a number of other things. There were energy credits. There was, as I mentioned, 45Q sequestration credit, and there were a number of other items that were designed around a composite of technology credits for vehicle refueling stations. But those 2 laws are really the stimulus in the United States. In other parts of the world, there are other types of stimuluses that governments are using, but in the United States, the 2 big items that have moved us into this age of energy and yet to be fulfilled are the BIL and the IRA. I'm going to leave this with really the fact that this is my day job, that continuity of effort is important. Even though we got a starting point here in 21, 22, we're looking to build a massive amount of new investment in both blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, geologic hydrogen, and all kinds of connected systems. That will take a continuity of effort, building demand side support, continuing to have federal R&D for budgets, development of codes and standards and certifications so that we can have harmonization, and we can know that ahead of product development, safety and compliance are taken into account. Permitting and acceptance of these projects has to be addressed. And then there's, there's always the subject of tax and limitation, which I spend a lot of time trying to get conclusions of the tax laws that were already written. The last thing I'll leave you with in sort of closing is that there's a real good reason for the United States to consider that there's an American style of hydrogen. We have the ability to export hydrogen just as we do LNG. We have the ability to create industries which transition some of our oil and gas activities and our heavy petrochemical and refining activities and make them more robust by introducing hydrogen. The world, it was commented earlier, the world is looking for the United States to be an exporter. Japan, Korea are looking for places to take either ammonia or direct hydrogen as an import to replace their LNG. And they see the United States and our energy systems as a means to achieve that. So hydrogen has a lot of activity, a lot of value, regardless of political affiliation, for why it is a good thing for the U.S. to pursue. It's absolutely necessary to achieve a piece of deep decarbonization, or we work on other elements of decarbonization. And I view it as a pretty good day job to have. So with that, I'll leave you. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, maybe one question, but Carrie, if there's any comments from the audience, I'm pleased to take it.
Right here, nice lined up there, speaking. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you for that excellent overview. What happens to federal funding for hydrogen if there's a change in administration?
That's a good question. And I sort of anticipated that question. I get it a lot. Well, there's a couple of things. And I think it is too early to really forecast exactly what might happen in this particular election. One thing that is real is that the IRA and the production tax credits that were put in are in the form of law. So any change in the fundamentals of credits go beyond administration, they'd have to go back to Congress. But as I also mentioned, beyond the presidential campaign that is going on within Congress itself, the benefits of the IRA accrue to many Republican states. It's an investment in manufacturing in places like Georgia and Texas and Minnesota. It is a way to extend the activities in oil and gas areas. It's a way to expand renewable resources that need to be built. That many of those are in historical Republican states, and it also creates an opportunity for the U.S. to have a strategic value of this. As I mentioned, we can become an exporter of hydrogen, and so that plays very well into the narrative, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and looking at hydrogen is a pretty good thing. Now, it takes an investment in a determination of clean energy, which may be a more progressive viewpoint. But if you unpack what hydrogen can do for that piece, that's really 15%, along with all the other things we're doing, it's meaningful. Members of both sides of the aisle look at the details and they realize this is a pretty good thing. So I think the original kind of point, Alan, that many of the features of hydrogen survive. They even thrive. How they might thrive, how they get adjusted, and what changes might happen regardless of an administration. There's a considerable amount of momentum. And there's also two other things to factor in that answer. One is that the rest of the world is doing this anyway. The United States is not going to fall behind. No administration is going to want to see the United States play second tier to Europe or second tier to China. And they are moving forward with major ambitions. And the United States is just going to want to keep making the investments because that's what we do.
I might ask one other question, aside from wondering if Taylor Swift is going to say that you're taking her eras to her kind of mantra fundraise. You have the 3 eras of hydrogen, so sure steal that. But you did discuss the idea of something about how the Treasury Department is doing accounting on hydrogen storage or something. I'm always interested in how people relate money and energy here, so I'm sure if you can elaborate a little bit more on what the
Sure.
discussion was there when we go to break.
Well, when we write these tax laws in the United States, they have to be, we write the general law and then they go to sort of an administrative agency determination for the interpretation of the laws. Sometimes that's very straightforward because Treasury's got to be the one that says to the taxpayer, You've achieved the compliance. You've done what was asked of you. Here's your credit. And they have to make it as binary as possible. So Congress will write laws that are somewhat imperfect. I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just that getting the unfinished business often falls to the agencies that have the knowledge. And in this particular case, the IRA had some pieces of the law that are still open to debate. One is a very large piece that's been an impediment to the industry, which is the determination of what qualifies for the green or the highest tier of $3 for the production tax credit. And there was a view of the law that it was intended to be broad and to foster the development of industry with a goal to decarbonization. And that got confounded by the introduction of some extra items that were not in the law in the form of what's known as the 3 pillars. I'm not going to spend a lot of time debating about that. The views of our industry have been public about the desire for flexibility in interpreting these laws and fostering an industry to do good versus putting barriers. We're seeing some erosion in those kind of philosophies in Europe that are rigid, and hopefully the Treasury will come out with guidance that is far more flexible. So there's unfinished business in terms of interpreting these laws that we've been waiting almost 2 years for. In the case of storage, it's a very important item that the storage credit was built. This is kind of strange architecture. It was built around a battery tax credit. And in defining it around a battery tax credit, it was energy and energy out. You put an electron in, you take an electron out. But hydrogen storage really is about creating an infrastructure system that isn't just energy in and direct energy out. It's a product, it's a molecule out that has to be used for various purposes in a marketplace. And the interpretations that are coming out of Treasury on the storage tax credit really limit this to scenarios where you would only you could only take the storage credit if your storage system were literally connected to a solar or wind facility and directly using that hydrogen for the production of electricity. And for anybody who's involved in massive energy systems, you realize that that's just far too narrow a definition. It really doesn't suit the purpose of creating massive infrastructure. The point is that converting these laws into tangible activity that engineers, that investors can make, takes a bit of extra work, and we are still somewhat confounded by the details of Treasury's guidance, which we hope to see done by the end of the year. Okay? Thank you.
Frank, hold on. We're now moving to a break for 15 minutes. We'll be back here at 1:30.